Hello, today we are talking about section 4.6, the quadratic formula and the discriminant. This video is going to cover the first goal of just using the quadratic formula. I'll make another video covering the discriminant. Alright, first of all, let's go ahead and talk about standard form of a quadratic equation. ax squared plus bx plus c. I'll use the colors for a, b, and c because in the quadratic formula, which basically is a formula that gives us the answers for x, that negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now you should know the quadratic formula. You should know it by heart. Try to write it down. Look to see if you got it right. Keep doing that until you get it absolutely right every time. You should know the quadratic formula by heart. Not hard to do, just have to know and remember it as you go. Okay, when you're using the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation, you obviously need it in standard form. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make sure we get this in standard form. Again, I still like to have a positive. This is positive here, so I will keep it that way. Here we have x squared plus 6x. I'm going to subtract 16 from both sides, so I get minus 16 equals 0. Okay, so at this point, I know that a is 1. I know that b is 6. And I know that c is a negative 16. Very important you remember the negative there. Okay, so I'm going to write these out. A equals 1. B is equal to 6. And C is negative 16. Now, when using the quadratic formula, I'm going to use what we call the discriminant first. Now, I'm going to introduce you to the discriminant. But the discriminant is basically b squared minus 4ac. Figure that out first, then plug it back in. You'll find yourself making less mistakes if you do that. Very important you get the discriminant correct in this. Okay, so in this situation, I have b squared minus 4 times a times c. So I am going to plug in. My b is 6. I'm going to plug in a is 1. And I always do this, just make sure. And c is negative 16. Oops, I put the wrong color. And c is negative 16. Now, when you calculate the discriminant, or b squared minus 4ac, order of operations is very important to use here. B squared, that should come first. That is 36. The next thing I like to do when I figure out the discriminant is I look at how many signs I'm multiplying together. I'm always multiplying one negative and then however many negatives I write in there for A and C. In this case, I have two negatives I'm multiplying together. That will indicate that I am adding the next number. Then I don't worry about those and I just go ahead and multiply. So in this case, 4 times 16 is 64. I am adding 36 plus 64, which is 100. Now, at this point, that is the discriminant. I am going to put that underneath the radical sign. So I go ahead and rewrite everything. Negative b, which means it's the opposite of b, so negative 6, plus or minus the square root. This is where I'm going to put the 100 now. All over 2 times a, but a is 1, so it's just going to be 2 times 1, or 2. Now, this is where you need to be able to simplify. And this one's not hard to simplify, but you do need to know how to do this. So, when you're simplifying this, you can take the discriminant or the square root of this if it's a perfect square. If it's not, you're going to see what to do in a little bit. This happens to be a perfect square. 100 is a perfect square, so it's 10. So negative 6 plus or minus 10 over 2. Now, we need to finish this because it can be finished. We're going to go ahead and rewrite this twice. Negative 6 plus 10 over 2. Negative 6 minus 10 over 2. These are actually two different answers. Okay, remember with quadratics, we typically come up with two answers. So let's go ahead and do this. Negative 6 plus 10 over 2 is 4 over 2, or 2. Negative 6 minus 10 over 2 is negative 16 over 2, or negative 8. So my two answers for this problem are 2 and negative 8. Now, again, before, just like I talked about last section, you might be able to do this faster by factoring, which obviously I should be able to factor this and get the same answers. Now, you're not always going to be able to factor and get the same answers because when something isn't factorable, you can't do that. So if I were to factor this, I get x plus 8, x minus 2. So x is negative 8 and positive 2. Obviously, much quicker to do factoring if you can. However, we're learning the quadratic formula. They're going to start off with some very simple problems to get nice answers to begin with. All right, let's do 1b, and then I'm going to go through examples 2, 3, and 4, and quickly go through those as well. All right, so here I would say, okay, A is 2, B is 25, C is 33, B squared minus 4AC is 25 squared minus 4 times 2 times 33. So the discriminant is 625 minus 8 times 33, and we get 264. So the discriminant is 361. Now I'm going to plug that into the quadratic formula. Negative 25, remember it's the opposite of b, so since b is positive 25, it's negative 25, plus or minus the square root of 361, that's where that goes, over 2 times 2. So remember, this is 2 times 2, or 4. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just put 4 in here. Now, let's go ahead and process this. X equals negative 25 plus or minus 361. The square root of 361 is 19, all over 4. We have two answers at this point. We have negative 25 plus 19 over 4, and we have negative 25 minus 19 over 4. So two separate answers. We want to make sure we simplify both of them. All right, negative 25 plus 19 is negative 6 over 4, which is negative 3/2. Negative 25 minus 19 is negative, what is that, negative 44 over 4, which is negative 11. So we have two answers for this, negative 3/2 and negative 11. Again, we like to make sure we put things in simplified fraction form when possible, and that would be an example of that. Okay, hopefully that helps you with understanding the quadratic formula. Let's go through some different problems just to see what happens. Okay, I'm going to move the camera. Okay, so here's the next set of problems in your book. Again, hopefully you're following the book and you're able to pay attention to what I'm trying to do here and where it comes up. So examples 2a, if I go ahead and use the quadratic formula here, I end up with Again, A is 1, B is negative 16, C is 64. So I use the discriminant, or do the discriminant, and I end up with negative 16 squared minus 4 times 1 times 64. Negative 16 squared is positive 256. 4 times 64 is also 256. This time the discriminant is 0. When that happens, then you have x equals positive 16 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 2, which of course is just 16 over 2, or 8. In this case, we only have one solution. And if you recall, what does a graph look like when you have one solution? Well, the graph, when you have one solution, means that the parabola has the vertex at 8. And in this case, the parabola is going to go up from there. So just keeping in mind that when you have one solution, or the discriminant is 0, the vertex is on the x-axis. Okay, let's go through the next one. This is going to be very similar. We have A equals 1, B equals 34, C equals 289, B squared minus 4AC equals 0. B squared minus 4AC equals 34 squared minus 4 times 1 times 289. If you look at this, you have 34 squared, which is 1156. 4 times 289 is also 1156, which is 0. Again, the discriminant is 0, so therefore you have x equals negative 34 plus or minus 0 over 2, which is negative 17. So you have one solution, and it's negative 17. Okay, hopefully I didn't go too fast on that. You can always rewind the video and see it again as I go through it. Okay, so let's go through this one, 3A. In your book, example 3A. All right, so A equals 3, B equals 5, C equals 1. B squared minus 4AC is 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times 1. This time you have 25 minus 12, which is 13. So the discriminant is 13. Okay, so when we do the quadratic formula, x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2 times 3. This time, the discriminant is not a perfect square, or 0. So therefore, your answer is, in this case, exactly this. Now again, this is simplified radical form. You could change these two answers to decimal form, but we prefer not to. Just leave them in simplified radical form. The square root of 13, you cannot simplify, so that's as good as it gets. All right, let's watch this one. This one's a little bit different, so pay attention to this one. A equals 1, B equals negative 8, C equals 9. We end up with B squared minus 4AC, which is negative 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 9. All right, so we end up with 64 minus 36. Okay, so 64 minus 36, I believe, is 28. Well, that's going to be interesting because the square root of 28 is simplifiable. So let's go ahead and see what happens. So we end up with x equals positive 8 plus or minus the square root of 28 all over 2. Now, when this is the case, we do not leave it just like this. We simplify radical form. So we simplify. We end up with 8 plus or minus 2 square root of 7 over 2. Now, 28 has a factor of 4 and a factor of 7. So the square root of 4 is 2. 2 squared is 7. Now, here's an interesting part where you really got to pay attention. Anytime the bottom number has a factor that goes into both the top numbers, then you can simplify it. In other words, 2 goes into 8, but it also goes into 2. That means that you can simplify it, meaning 2 goes into both, so it goes in there 4 plus or minus the square root of 7 times. But you can only do that if the bottom number or a factor of it goes into both of them. Okay? So the answers for this are both 4 plus n minus the square root of 7. All right, so let's go to this one. 4a, let's see what happens. A is 3, b is 5, c is 4. b squared minus 4ac is 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times 4, which is 25 minus 48, which is negative 23. Okay, so this time the discriminant's negative. When that happens, you end up with x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root of negative 23 over 6, because it's 2 times 3. Now, this is not simplified because you have a negative underneath the radical. Now, 23 is not have a perfect square factor, so you can not take out any factors other than the negative 1, and you get negative 5 plus or minus I square root of 23 all over 6. And that is simplified radical form. Make sure you put your answers in simplified radical form. Okay, in this one, it's going to be very similar. A equals 1, B equals negative 4, C equals 13. We have B squared minus 4AC. So that is negative 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times 13, which is 16 minus 52, which is negative 36. Well, that's interesting. Now that's a perfect square, which is kind of nice, but it's negative. So when you use the quadratic formula, you end up with positive 4 because 4 is negative, or b is negative, so it becomes positive here, plus or minus the square root of negative 36 all over 2 times 1, or 2. Okay, so when that happens, we get square root of negative 36 is 6i. So we have 4 plus or minus 6i over 2. And again, just because you can put 2 into both of them, you can simplify. If it only goes into 1, you can't. So make sure you be careful there. 2 plus or minus 3i. There's my 2 solutions. 2 plus 3i and 2 minus 3i. There's the first goal. I will produce another video on the discriminant, which I've already talked about many times, so hopefully it will go quick.